how to make digital content, products and services accessible for the deaf and hard of hearing community. When we design based on our own experiences and requirements, we can unintentionally exclude large groups of people from using our products and services. That's why it's so important to include people from historically marginalized communities in the research and design process. Hi, I'm Marina. Welcome to Inclusive by Design. Our guest today is Karina Butler-Demir, who is an MBA student at Northeastern University and an activist for the deaf and hard of hearing community. Karina is passionate about accessible technology and specializes in closed captioning for audio content. In this video, we'll discuss the spectrum of deafness, a respectful way to refer to a person with a hearing loss, differences between ASL, BSL, and English language, why it's important to invite deaf people into the design process, differences between captions, subtitles, transcript, and interpretation, and how the deaf community experiences music. Hi, Karina. Thank you so much for joining me today. We know each other through Equity Army, where we worked on first creating inclusive principles and then also launching them. And we also worked on the accessibility initiative. But I'd love to learn more about you. I know that you are an MBA student and also advocating for the deaf and hard of hearing community and accessibility technology. Could you share your story with us, please?
Absolutely. Thank you, Irina, for having me. I'm so excited to have this chat with you. Like you said, I am an MBA student at Northeastern University, graduating this May. Definitely looking forward to continuing this work in accessible design. I am a deaf individual. I was born deaf. That lived experience makes me passionate about accessible design. But what got me into this space, I was reading Annie Jean-Baptiste's book, Building for Everyone. And I just realized, there's other people who care about making technology and products accessible for everyone. And I just felt seen and I wanted to be a part of that. I know as a deaf individual, especially recently with the pandemic and technology moving at a very fast rate, I've noticed that we're just kind of left in the dark a lot with captioning on anything with audio, ASL or BSL interpretation for especially important moments in our history or anything to do with the pandemic.
Karina, so now when we are learning more about historically marginalized groups, there are lots of discussions and debates around inclusive language. So could you share with us what is the respectful way to refer to a person with hearing impairment or deaf person?
So that's a great question. I think that the deaf community is different in this way because we have the culturally capital D deaf people, and then there are hard of hearing people. It's really how people identify, and usually people like myself who identify as capital D deaf culturally, they actually like that, including myself, to put deaf first because that's a big part of our identity. However, it's important to remember that with anything we talk about today, including this, it's not one size fits all. It's all about the individual person. Deafness and being hard of hearing is a spectrum in so many ways, not just decibels.
And could you tell me a little bit more about deaf from capital D versus deaf from lowercase d?
Capital D deaf, it includes a whole culture of people. Most people who are capital D deaf are within the deaf community. They attend deaf schools, they attend deaf events, and mostly that's because we have a language. Our first language is either American Sign Language or British Sign Language. It depends on where you are. So just a way to communicate with people like you. And we have a long history, very fruitful history of advocacy, but also just trying to keep our culture as vibrant as it is without having to always need what hearing people think that we need is really what the culture of deafness is about.
And you mentioned, it sounds like there is a difference between American Sign Language and British Sign Language. How big is the difference, and how can you, for example, understand both, or do you have to learn both of them?
ASL is a lot different than BSL. I think that there's still some level of communication that can happen between the two users, the two signers. I know that, especially with interpretation, it's very important that users get either option, depending on technology, so that they can get the full accessibility, because there are a lot of differences. There's even a lot of differences within American sign languages. There's Black Sign Language for the Black deaf community. And, sign language isn't as rigid as English. And that's another important thing to remember is ASL is not English. BSL is not English. They're completely separate languages. That's why it's important to think about that kind of thing in inclusiveness, because, not everybody deaf can rely on captioning in itself.
This is really interesting. And how do you communicate within the deaf community with people from the same community?
So most of the deaf people I communicate with are all virtual. I have met them through social media, through different events. And that's what I'm grateful about with the pandemic, is I have been able to really virtually connect with people who are like me. Follow a ton of accounts. There's deaf influencers. There's people I have met on Zoom. My spouse is actually trying to learn ASL. So we're doing classes together virtually with a queer deaf specific ASL course, which is exciting.
Amazing. And what is your take on deaf community and disability, and also person first language? I know that you mentioned that there are differences, but I'd love to learn your take on.
Yeah, so I think, like I said, most culturally deaf people do prefer deaf instead of the person first, but I don't think we'll, argue if you say something like Karina, who is deaf. But again, it's such a big spectrum where everyone's not necessarily born with deafness. It comes later in life. There's so many factors that are included in that. And I would say with anything with disability, it's always great to put a person first. And then if you're talking to someone like you just did, just ask them, because of that spectrum, it's great to just ask the person, how do you prefer I communicate with you? How would you like me to refer to you with other people, especially in a work environment?
Thank you, Karina. And I'd love to ask you a little bit more about technology. And as our audience are mainly designers, but also product creators, could you tell us about these moments of exclusion or mismatch that you experience with technology?
Really, it's been with social media content, especially with, a lot of information going around on social media these days. I find that so much content is not captioned. It has gotten better recently with, Instagram, TikTok providing services additional filters that can automatically caption. But, a lot of people don't know that they can add that and why it should be added. And I think another thing that I've noticed is gaming. I'm a gamer, and I just think it could be better. A lot of games do include captioning for any spoken content, but there's still a lot of content in games that it depends on a lot of audio type of signals or indications that, say something coming for you. And, I've noticed that unless I have the volume on like blast, I don't know, or I don't hear those things. And I'm sure a lot of other deaf and hard of hearing individuals feel the same way.
And what is the role of technology in your life?
What isn't the role of technology? I like to game in my free time. I have my phones. I have the computer. I'm lucky enough to have the privilege of having hearing aids that can, stream a lot of this stuff, which makes it easier for me to hear. Very similar to why you're wearing your headphones. It's just easier to communicate that way when it's right in your ears without all the background noise. So yeah, technology, things like smart devices in the home. I have a Google Home Nest situation, and that has captioning on it, which is great because, I don't always have my hearing aids in and I need to ask Google something.
So interesting. And could you tell a little bit more about what technology do you find helpful?
helpful technology is definitely, I would say, hearing aids. And again, not all deaf people wear hearing aids or cochlear implants. If you want to learn more about, there's research there. I won't go into that. But definitely the improvement of hearing aids for me is, when I was a child, there wasn't a lot of hearing aid technology. So, the fact that I can stream my phone, like music is just like, I used to be so ashamed of them. But now I'm like, oh, this is cool. This is exciting. People wear AirPods. I don't have to get them.
Exactly. Amazing. And you mentioned captions already, and I know that's one of your specializations as accessibility advocate. Could you tell me a little bit more about the difference between captions and subtitles or transcript, and also preferences and different use?
Closed captioning, or shorthand is captioning, is designed for people who can't hear the content. It doesn't mean it's for deaf people. It's people who have the audio off as well. It's designed for people who can't hear the content, meaning that it's not just the spoken words. It's also, any indicators, like I said before, if there's a bell or someone maybe grunts or any background noise that's important to the content. So really that's captioning, and that's what it's designed for. Subtitles are designed for people who don't understand the language in which is being spoken. So subtitles really refers to, if I want to watch a Japanese movie, I will have subtitles on technically. And a lot of devices will have the difference between captioning and subtitles. And a lot of people who design these devices don't know the difference. So it's really, I think that's important. And obviously transcript is more of a hard, this is what was said, and it's written in paragraph form. I would say almost like a script that is descriptive of what was said.
Amazing. And so for example, I transcribe and fix captioning for all the videos that I create, and I'd love to hear firsthand, what do I, for example, need to be mindful of when I'm creating this, or not creating, but fixing these captions? What are the most important elements? So for example, when we talk, there are sometimes some words that don't really have the meaning, but potentially express the mood or the tone. Do I add them or leave them in the captions, or would it be easier if these words that don't really have the meaning removed and you get quicker to the message and what person is trying to articulate? Could you tell me your point of view on this?
Yeah, and I really think it depends on the content. For a movie or, a longer format like movies and shows and maybe a podcast or a YouTube video, it's definitely important to fix those captions, like you said. Captioning is available for people on most videos, not all. If you just click on the YouTube and ask for the captioning, but again, fixing those captions is huge. I know you're going to fix these captions, but live captioning is not perfect technology. Hopefully it gets better. I'm sure it will as algorithms keep going. So like you said, fixing them is the number one important thing you can do. The second is definitely keep it as simple as possible. Not a ton of adding, very much like you said, a mood, or I can't think of an exact example, but if there is, especially music, I like when there's lyrics of the music, especially if it's important to the content. I want to know why those lyrics were said. And, I want to know that it's music by the musical note symbol. I think if there's moves or sighs, it's always good to put those in parentheses. But again, simple, so that I can, or we can read fast as possible while watching the video. And not too much of changing words. I think that makes it a little bit more inclusive, especially if someone like me who can read the lips and read the captioning and also can hear the video to some capacity. I'm going to notice those differences, and that's going to confuse me a bit. In a format like this, an interview, I think cutting out things like which I've said probably 20 times already, is okay. I think that can actually fill up too much, just like it does in a conversation.
So interesting. And you mentioned music, and obviously obviously in the films and other more creative formats, there is often a lot of reliance on this creative element like music, and what's the accurate way, what's the helpful way to describe it, because in music you can express certain mood or certain tone, and sometimes sound is as important as the image. What can we do to make it inclusive and helpful?
So even if it's music without words, I often see things like ethereal music, or, describing the mood of the music and saying this is moody music or electronic music or hip hop bass, slow hip hop. It could be really, especially if the designer or whoever is putting this content together, they very specifically chose that music for their creativeness, and they edited it with that music for a purpose. And I think that all of their audience should be able to enjoy it in that same way.
So maybe in a way it's part of responsibility of the director or editor of the film to share it or to explain in words what they were trying to articulate with that choice. Right.
Yes.
And is there any way for you at the moment to understand the tone? So I don't know, is it easy to understand that the person is getting angry or happy, or their voice is going up or their voice is going down? Or do you rely, for example, on facial expressions?
That's a great question. Again, this is where it comes into my lived experience could be very different to the person next to me, even if they have the same exact hearing loss. If you've ever looked at an audiogram, there's so many, it's a graph, there's ups and downs. And what that means is what you can hear is a lot different from the next person. It's I would say like a thumbprint or fingerprints. Everybody has different levels. It's, for instance, for myself, I don't hear higher pitches as much. And as far as tone goes, again, the person, and I think it has a lot to do with how you were raised. And if you are a primarily ASL or sign language user, I think that, yes, we use body language indicators all the time. I always like to say I can read facial expressions and micro expressions very well because I'm reading lips, and I depend on that a lot. Again, that depends on the next person. And I think that depends on the person, individuals. And I think that's exactly where maybe some creativity can come in. And that's why you want to include everybody in these conversations, because, I know what I know, but maybe there's another deaf person who's like, hey, this is how we can describe the tone of what's happening in this audio.
So interesting. And you mentioned interpreters as well. Can you tell me a little bit more about how deaf community, do they rely mainly on interpreters or captions, for example, or is it personal choice, or how does this work?
Definitely personal choice. I'm a believer in everything should have, if possible, a square in the corner with an interpreter. And it's also very important there's a lot of guidelines around interpreting, because you don't want someone who isn't qualified to interpret. And usually you would like to have someone who is deaf be the interpreter. So again, not all deaf people are completely hard of hearing, but they can read the body language. And the reason we call it interpreting instead of translating is exactly that. We're not translating word for word. ASL has much different grammar than English does. So that's why it's interpreting. And part of the interpretation is not just our hand, but it's also how we express our face. So our eyebrows move when there's questions. That's why interpretation is so important, and why it's important to really bring deaf people into the conversation when it comes to interpretation. And it depends on the content again. So I know recently Xbox game for the Horizon has included ASL and BSL interpretation as an option, accessibility option to put on the screen, which to me is amazing. distracting in so many ways, because they can indicate that there's, a sound coming, or like I said before, not all people who ASL is their first language or sign language is their first language understand English and can use captioning. So especially like a video game, right? There's other things going on. I don't want to read word for word what's happening. So it's just another form of accessibility that I find amazing. And I really hope the gaming community, the gaming design community really starts to consider that as part of their aspects.
So interesting. And is there ever a situation when you're relying on both, or actually using both captioning and interpretation at the same time?
Absolutely. So I would say the biggest example I can think of is when the pandemic first started, the live captioning. Well, at the time, the White House site didn't have captioning available, and nor did they have ASL interpretation available, where, again, it can't just be someone who's off to the side where they're only getting part-time screen time, and things like that is very important to have both options. I think that because live captioning is not perfect and we need interpreters, especially for moments like that. I remember calling my audiologist at the very beginning. I needed something and they said, "Do you know there's a pandemic happening?" And I said, "Yes." And they said, "Do you know how many people have called not knowing there's a pandemic?" And I looked into it, and it's because there wasn't enough accessibility in terms of news or availability of that information for the deaf and hard of hearing community.
That's incredible. So yeah, I guess we always need to pay extreme attention to the information that is that important and essential for people. And we started talking a little bit about music and expression of the mood, but I saw in the news that recently Foo Fighters' Dave Grohl opened up about his hearing loss on Howard Stern show. And he also talked about how he can hear the smallest nuances when it comes to mixing and editing music, but it's really hard to hear for him, person who sits next to him. And actually he was lip reading for 20 years. And I wonder, what is your experience with music and how do you experience it, but also do you enjoy it? Is it important to you?
I watched that video that you sent me, and I found that so interesting and also not surprising that he has that level of hearing loss from being in a rock band. So this, I think, is a good time to share some facts from the WHO website. So currently, and this is the biggest reason why it's so important to consider deaf and hard of hearing people in your inclusiveness, because they're over 5% of the world population, or about 430 million people are deaf or hard of hearing in a disabling sense. There's a lot of hearing people who have some hearing loss, but it's really about where it's considered disabling, which is over 35 decibels. So what I found interesting that I didn't know until doing research is estimated by 2050 that over 700 million people, or 1 in every 10 people, will have a disabling hearing loss. And that, I think that points to, how much more technology we have and people blasting music in their ears and not necessarily being aware of that. A rock band that's going to be for 20 years next to loud blasting speaker. People love going to concerts, and there's, so many examples, so many obvious examples. And I think that's something to consider as far as like the future of hearing loss. And what he said was so interesting because he identifies differently as far as his deafness or hard of hearing. And I think that's a good example again. I know I keep saying it, but I want to press that point of why it's such a big spectrum. He has lost his hearing over a certain amount of time. So his baseline is hearing. So he has all of that to consider, and he has lost it. So yes, he can probably still hear the very specific things, but the decibels that he may have lost are having to do with voices. And when you have so many background noises and stuff like that, and like he said, restaurants, dark lighting and lip reading, he mentioned that it was really hard with masks. And I think that's a good example to show, hey, we should take a little bit better care of our hearing. If I'm going to be next to something loud, I maybe should put some earplugs in. So I found it interesting that he doesn't want to change anything about it. And that's okay. And that's how he's able to do his job and move throughout the world.
Exactly. And he talks about it as almost the part of experience. And he said he's not going to, he wouldn't change anything what he did before, because then it creates almost like a fake or not full experience or connection with the audience and the sound around, which is fascinating as well. But also it brings up this point about hearing loss and music, because music is sound and music is really quite hard to translate because it has quite, all elements relying on the sound. Could you tell me a little bit more about your experience with music? Do you enjoy it? How do you experience it?
Good point you made about sound in music. I think the biggest assumption that is made about deaf and hard of hearing people is that we don't listen to music or we don't like music or enjoy it, but that is completely opposite of the case. There's actually a lot more than sound that goes into music. There's a lot of vibrations, heavy bass and heavy guitar. We can feel that. And everybody hears music differently. And that's the beauty of music. And I think for me, I do prefer more bassy kind of music, hip hop, rap, electronic music. And I've always been drawn to that because that's what I can appreciate the most about the music. And growing up, I never knew the lyrics to songs. Like I would just make them up. So it's great now that we have this technology where we can read the lyrics as we go. I remember having my little CDs and pulling out the little pamphlets and reading the lyrics in the car as it's playing. So it's cool that there's more options. Again, it could be better. And I recently, Spotify and Apple have provided lyrics for videos and music. And that's amazing to me because now I know I can understand the lyrical portion of the music, and it's poetry.
This is so interesting. You mentioned a couple of features and technologies that help you. Is there anything else or any other events, any kind of accessibility elements that you would like to highlight as helpful for everyone who watched this video to understand who they could learn from as the best examples?
So, Irina, when you said events, the first thing that came to my mind, because it more recently, is the Super Bowl here in America. I know a lot of other people watch, not just Americans watch the Super Bowl, but it's arguably one of the most, if not the most watched event in American TV. So recently, there were two deaf rappers that were slated to perform the songs, the halftime show in ASL. So they are called ASL performers because it's not interpretation. It informs interpretation, but it's their version of the performance. And that's really accessible for the deaf and hard of community in so many ways, but it's also very enjoyable. They bring so many elements into how we can understand what's being performed by the artist. And the two rappers were Wawa and Sean Forbes. They're very big in the deaf community, and everybody in the deaf community was so excited that they were going to be the halftime show. And it was disappointing to say the least because they got no airtime on the mainstream halftime show. I think a lot of people were under the assumption that they were going to be either a box in the corner or a part of the performance, the main performance. Nowhere to be seen. I was there to watch that, and it was obviously an amazing halftime show as a millennial, but I was really disappointed about that. And the deaf community was too. And it turns out that if we wanted to watch that performance, we would have had to download a separate separate app that was only available on a device that can download that application. And it was only available there. They weren't included in the performance. They were off to the side and separate. And it's just a disappointment because there was so much hype around it and so much excitement for it to be an afterthought. And I've heard about this a lot in the music industry and concerts. And, sometimes interpretation or performance, ASL performance, BSL performance is an afterthought. And that's a problem because I think it could be a part of it. I think that it could be incorporated in a performance. And, there's been cases where interpreters kicked off the stage because the artists, rightfully so, they weren't included. The artists didn't know that they were going to be there. It's just, oh, we need an interpreter. Let's throw them on the stage if they even find one or a qualified one. There have been times where an unqualified interpreter was on stage and didn't know any sign language and was just waving their hands. And it was, that was big news in the deaf community. And that's why it's so important to have the right people who know the intricacies of what should be happening if you're going to get an interpreter for a performance for audio content.
So it's about making it more intentional and probably turning it more into a norm, right? So this is something to be expected, right? And musicians are not surprised if they see another person on stage.
Yeah, in a perfect world, everybody would know sign language. We would all be able to communicate so much better. And there's going to be almost 50% more deaf people in the future. And that's so telling. And it could be better. It can always be better.
And when you communicate with brands online, when you need to, get in touch with them, what are the most convenient, comfortable ways for you to do that? Because as we know, often brands just have a phone number as the primary option, but what would be your preference?
For me, it would be any sort of non-phone communication. I do like those where you can communicate with someone, a real person on, the text options. And, a lot of companies, the bigger ones, do offer a relay service, which is when you can call into a relay and have them interpret on a video format while you're talking to a customer service. But I know for me, especially if I'm with any brand, any content, I prefer visuals. I prefer, graphs and any information I can get visually. And I think that's why there's the importance of inclusivity and accessibility, because you also have to think about the people who there's a lot of deaf blind people, and that's part of the inclusion, because visuals are not going to be, I don't want to make that assumption, but visuals are most likely not going to be a part of that person's accessibility.
If we think blue sky, what would the world look like if you and your community designed it?
The world. So everybody would be required to learn sign language in school. There would be a box on everything with an interpreter, and there would be captioning on everything, even live in a play. I want to see Broadway plays, but I won't go see them unless they have captioning options. So all that, again, blue sky, perfect world. And I know it's never going to perfection is not possible, but progress is.
Yeah, absolutely. And have you experienced some of the plays being captioned or interpreted?
Yeah, there are some venues or playhouses that offer captioning in there. They might have it in certain areas of the venue where if you say, hey, I am a person in need of captioning, they will make sure that you have seats there, but not enough, not nearly enough. There's so many plays, live comedians that I've wanted to see that I just said, no, I'm not going to spend money to see this if it's not available and accessible to me.
And is there any other examples or information that you would like to share that we didn't discuss yet?
Maybe not necessarily examples. I'm sure there's plenty of things I didn't think about. I could talk for days. Again, there's deaf culture studies classes, plenty of information on Google and the internet. And if you ever come across a deaf or hard of hearing person, ask that person. And, maybe Google a little bit before we ask the person something that can be Googled. But I think the main thing to remember that I want people to get out of this conversation is 5% of the world is deaf or hard of hearing. It's important to remember that deafness is a spectrum in so many ways. And the great thing about how we're looking at accessibility in design is that we're creating a baseline. And this is something I would like to see in schools too, where rather than an individual purely relying on an individual's accommodation requirements, the baseline is accessible for people who may not even know they have a disability. Just having that available, especially for people who cannot advocate for themselves, is so important. With technology where there's millions of users, it's impossible for someone to call in and say, hey, I need this. And maybe they're calling, if you can call in, maybe they don't know that there's, for every one person who's able to advocate for themselves, there might be 10 other people who don't know that that's an option or don't know that they need that. And that's why it's so important in the work that we do at Equity Army and in the inclusive design community, is that we think about how we can consistently keep that baseline and keep learning and progress towards that blue sky that you were speaking of.
Karina, thank you so much for sharing your story and your view as a person from the deaf and hard of hearing community. And I would love to encourage everyone to be mindful of everything Karina shared today and include these requirements in your designs and in your content right from the very start. Thank you so much for joining, and see you next time.
Thank you so much, Irina.